Thank you and welcome to the May. Can you believe it's May already? CRADLE seminar. I think we have another one in May as well too. We're very overexcited. And the very first CRADLE seminar I went to, I think, was by one Jack Broadbent in Burwood. I don't think I'd started at CRADLE yet, and I went to see this seminar and by someone who's very impressive. And I was so excited to hear about the work that you were doing. That was about 8 years ago. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Jack Broadbent. But before I do, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we stand. We're on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I'd like to also, as always, remember that the land has never been ceded, and pay my respects to any Indigenous Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander folk online or in the room at the moment. And now, Jack, to you. You are now Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Sessional Academic Experience, Deputy Head of School Psychology and a Fellow for the Centre of Research and Assessment in Digital Learning. And can I say that it seems to me that Jack does more before breakfast than I do in a week. She's incredibly productive. And this project, which I was tangentially involved with, or I was more than tangent, I was involved with this project. And it just is an illustration to me of Jack's ability to do so many things at once. This is, I think, a really exciting project that you have carried on, and I think everyone will be very interested to hear what you found.
Thanks, everyone. Or they might be like a little bit traumatized because we're going to talk about COVID for like the next 55 minutes. I know certainly at the time when we were doing this project, well, at the time of COVID, I was Associate Head of School Teaching and Learning during the lockdown and everything in Melbourne. And so doing this project was a little bit triggering, which is why we came up with the very friendly name BERT, which stood for Beyond Emergency Remote Teaching. So thanks for having me here today to talk about this project. It was a pretty trying time for any of you that were locked in your house in Melbourne for 2 years. We did 2 years of online teaching. It was 6 trimesters in a row. So before I kind of take you back to COVID, the negative things, the really good things about COVID were that I learned how to be a really good puzzler. And I didn't make sourdough, but I did learn how to make pasta and gnocchi. But the freeway near my house was dead quiet for like 2 years, which was amazing. Ugg boots, pants, underdresses, so good. Still doing it in 2024. If you see me on Zoom in 2024, I definitely have my Ugg boots on and some pants under the dress that I'm wearing. Another good thing for those, remember Dan? It was a good day during COVID if Dan turned up in his North Face jacket. Just having the time to do all those things you really want to do, like color coordinate your bookshelf by pulling all the books out and reordering them, and just all the fun people that I got to spend time with during that time. So that was kind of the start of this project, was COVID and emergency remote teaching. So if you were teaching at that time, you'll remember what it was like. It was this middle of March in 2020, and emergency remote teaching really is this unplanned, quick adaptation. Teachers had to use like a range of different digital technologies at the time, from digital classrooms to learning management systems, like online collaboration tools like Teams. They had to very quickly think about a range of online strategies for their teaching, including like synchronous and asynchronous activities. There was online polls, people like uploading their teaching materials, and people, instead of having, office hours, they're having these virtual office hours. And I would say that the classrooms during that time, especially in 2020, were transformed with varying amounts of success. And, I think we should keep in mind it was an emergency. So the focus really was on preserving instruction rather than just enhancing learning quality. In tandem, so during this time, we try to get everything online. institutions had to really rethink their assessment strategies, particularly for those assessments that were on campus. So I think of the big one, on-campus exams. Some studies really did find that it was this unique opportunity for academics to experiment with new assessment techniques, but most studies pretty much said academics took what they had and they just kind of transferred it to an online environment best as they could. During this time too, we got all these students online without really thinking about how they were going to work autonomously and independently. Something really close to my heart was self-regulated learning. How, you know, we didn't design for that online. We were literally just kind of transferring a lot of the time from what we were doing on campus. Many academics during COVID felt really ill-prepared, and they had concerns about the quality of their own teaching. And I asked ChatGPT to do me a picture of emergency remote teaching. And you can see here, this is, I think, Zoom on the wrong side of the computer with people that kind of look like zombies. But the first picture that I asked Chat to do was way more triggering, because I just thought, yeah, there were people for 2 years locked in their house with kids at their table. So I stuck with the zombie Zoom backwards picture instead. So if you do a Google search, like a Google Scholar search even, and you just put in the terms COVID and higher education, it brings up over 4 million hits of papers that were, and articles and discussions that occurred during that time. So I just picked the first ones that came up. There's no reason why I picked them, but lots of these studies that we saw come out were around the early time and mid time of the pandemic. There was a lot of people saying, oh, I was doing this thing in my classroom, we went online, and this is how I did that. And a lot of those kind of talked about, how students felt in those papers. And we were kind of interested in more than just what did I do at the time in this emergency. We were really interested in how education change itself starts to unfold in different circumstances. And we were really interested in not what we did during the pandemic, because we had no choice, or sort of, but what we did when we had choice again. So what did we do after the pandemic? Did we go back to what we were doing in 2019, or did we adopt new practices moving forward? A systematic review from 2023 by Imran et al. Analysed 68 COVID studies, and it really aimed to identify these themes of what happens in blended and online learning post-COVID. But in these articles, the majority of them, again, were very early in the pandemic, and none of them looked at what happened before the pandemic and compared it to what happened afterwards. The articles in the systematic review were very student focused. So it was a lot of an educator doing something and then asking a student, did you like this? How satisfied are you with this change? So they really put, at the end of their systematic review, put a call out to future research, that future research should focus on the long-term effects of COVID-19 on teaching modes and the resulting change in curriculum development that occurred. And Kurz-Brenner noted that much of the current research predominantly centres around kind of this mid and early pandemic phases, and there's not much that has come out since that really focuses on post-pandemic impacts. And they argued that it's still really difficult to grasp a clear picture of the effects of the pandemic on education in the various sectors of education worldwide. So there were two things that we were really focused on in this project, trying not to use the C word, the before, which was 2019, and we were really interested in what happened after. So, we have a lot of literature around what occurred during COVID, and we wanted to kind of ignore that middle part and say, what remained afterwards? The other thing that we were really interested in were the factors that drove that change. So we looked at, compared at Deakin, class time, assessment methods, and exams, looking at what we did in 2019 and compared it to what we were doing in 2022/2023. And then we also use Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory to have a think about what were the underlying drivers of those changes. So this is just a quick outline of the participants in our study. We did both a very extensive survey, so thanks to anybody who's online who actually participated, because it was dreadfully long. And then 21 people also got interviewed. And you can see here, majority were over the age of 40. There was equal kind of portions of slightly more females than males. Most were lecturer or senior lecturer level, had more than 10 years experience, had a pretty teaching focused role because the average was about 52% of their workload was teaching. And that was spread across all arts and education, health, science, engineering, built environment, and business and law faculties at Deakin. So I'm going to talk you through these kind of 3 things that we looked at to see what changed after the pandemic. They were learning activities, we looked at assessments, and we looked at exams. And then I'll talk to you about some of the factors that drove people to maintain changes, right? This is not what drove people to change during the pandemic. This is like what encouraged them to stay and adopt new practices. So I don't expect you to be able to read that in detail, but there was a lot of things. As I said, it was a very long survey, but one of the things we looked at was all these different types of learning activities. So these ranged from seminars to lectures to group work, from on-campus to online. The lines that you can see here, the black lines really represent when something has been done more. The little checkered ones is when something has been done less than 2019. And then the stripes are no change. So in terms of learning activities, we had 82% of our respondents say they had retained at least one change, right? So something, well, at least one thing was different from 2019 in 2022/2023. And the majority of the activities that you can see here increased or were the same pre-post pandemic. The only exception to this, so the only thing that there was less of was on-campus lectures, decreased in most units. And so this really kind of reflects a move away from running the same lecture multiple times on different campuses. At Deakin, we have, how many campuses do we have? 4 or 5 campuses. And so often they'll be running the same lecture multiple times that week at all the different campuses. So we saw a lot more of people having a live online lecture that everybody could attend or having pre-recorded content. So just to hone in on those things that increased the most post-pandemic, we saw significant increases in really online learning activities. So the top ones were pre-recorded chunked videos. So think those like lots of little 10-minute videos, replacing that on-campus lecture some of the time. And that was tied in also with online self-paced content. So they've got these little videos, then they've got content, like a module that they're working through, and that module also included online self-paced activities, think H5P objects. On top of that, there was a lot more online interaction and online Q&A sessions. So think virtual office hours, and lots of people started doing, tacking onto the end of the lecture, like an online live Q&A session that students could ask questions about. These really continued because it promoted so much convenience for students, or at least that's what the academics told us. And so they felt like they were giving students a lot more choice to engage in learning content in a way that really aligned with their circumstances and their needs. And it's important to remember here that they weren't taking anything away, with the exception of the on-campus lectures. This was them saying, we're going to keep all these traditional options that we had in 2019, the way that we always did it, but actually we see really a lot of value in, having these extra options for students to choose from. So the biggest, unsurprisingly, based on that, the biggest theme that really came through was this theme about student well-being and student equity. So there was this particular desire to want to reduce the gap between the advantages and disadvantages of the 2 learning modes, so on campus and online, as well as to personalize the experience so that synchronous and asynchronous students are acknowledged and have activities explicitly designed for them. One academic actually raised the concern that the level of inclusivity was at a level of access that might have been actually really restrictive pre-COVID. It might have been to the point where we weren't letting people into education really just based on their ability to get inside a classroom. What was also really interesting, especially coming from Deakin, because we already had a good, strong online teaching and learning culture here, was that quite a few interviewees realised that they didn't really understand online students in the way that they thought they had until they had everybody locked in the house online for 2 years. And one academic said, we kind of had this assumption that online students were like a cloud and they just wanted to float in and out, and they didn't really want to be anchored to anything, and they were quite happy to do things on their own terms. And certainly there are a cohort of students that love that, but the pandemic really forced us to say, okay, let's structure their time specifically, and it's been a huge success. Unlike this cloud, where I thought this would look really cool and actually turned out quite lame. But just imagine a floating cloud, okay? So assessments. Again, we looked at a range of assessment tasks. We asked them about what they did in 2019. We then asked them, what are you doing in kind of 2023? And the assessment tasks range from a whole lot of things, from like authentic assessment, inclusive assessment, programmatic assessment. And we found that 63% of academics had retained changes. So something was different from 2019 in 2023. There was not a single area that most units focused less on, right? So people were either doing more of something or staying the same. So just to kind of focus in on those ones that they were doing more. So compared to 2019, our academics were doing more authentic assessment, more scaffolded assessment, and more online delivery of assessment. There was this real noticeable trend towards utilising authentic assessment tasks, aiming to kind of enhance the assessments to have real world context, to make them for the students like more meaningful, more relevant, and more valuable really for students. And I actually think it's kind of weird to say, I actually do think this is weird to say that we were locked in our house for like 2 years, and the result of that was we made more authentic assessments, because we actually pared back so much authenticity, I think, at that time, especially for things like placements and work integrated learning. But actually, it really helped to refocus academics. And I think it was part of a sort of bigger picture if you step back, and we're going to talk about exams next, sort of stepping back as academics really had to think holistically about their assessment approaches. They made changes to their exams, and they sort of thought, well, I still need to assess students. And because they were kind of revamping, it gave them the opportunity to, do something that they really wanted to do, like making it authentic. There was also a shift towards employing scaffolded and sequential assessment tasks. And some of the reason this occurred, or the academics told us that this occurred, was they noticed how stressed students were getting during the pandemic, having high stakes, highly weighted assessments, and really saw the value in being able to assist students by kind of tailoring their assessments to be more progressive and more staggered, to give them an opportunity to really move in a less stressful way throughout the course, and giving them, so that they could build their own understanding over time. And again, self-regulated learning, for me, that really resonates, because some students, we really did chuck them into the deep end. They didn't really know what they were doing, and we found, it was really hard to have like this massive assignment due at the end of the semester. So being able to scaffold and have sequential assessments really helped. And they also, one academic commented, moving forward, that student motivation is really mixed. And by having these scaffolded and sequential assessment pieces, it meant that those that were really highly motivated could connect on a really high level, but it also gave the students with low motivation, they could still just potter along, still get solid results, and it didn't matter if they missed like one bit of an assessment here or there. And lastly was the online assessments. So many more online assessments, and really academics spoke about the advantages that online assessment gave, particularly around equal treatment of online and on-campus students. Certainly, you know, I've taught in subjects before where you design an assessment for on-campus and then you just kind of like work out how you're going to do it online. What's really nice about this is when you design it for online, it kind of is more inclusive for everybody. They also noticed it was just much easier to manage in terms of like absenteeism from students, you know, especially if that assessment needed to be on campus previously. Had this great quote from an academic that said, "A lot of our decisions came down to, is this fair for everyone? Are we actually disadvantaging people by having this assessment?" And our answer to the assessment was absolutely we were, and we had qualitative and quantitative feedback to support that. And that's the reason why they decided to keep their assessments online post-pandemic. The last area that we looked at was examinations. So what changed? And this was huge. Everybody across the world, you know, that had on-campus exams had to find an alternative way of doing exams during the pandemic. But what's really interesting about examinations is we had the choice to come back on campus, right? As soon as we were back on campus, exams could have been back on campus. So we wanted to have a look at what happened at Deakin. So in our study, 54% of the academics said, yes, in 2019, I had an on-campus invigilated exam in my unit. And from that, 97% of them were like on campus and invigilated. So in 2022, 2023, there was a really big shift. So we found that there was like one on-campus exam, which was like a clinical exam. And 17% moved to be online but invigilated. 44% were unsupervised and online, so like no proctoring. And 33% totally just got rid of their exam. They said, you know what, I'm just like not even going to have an exam in my unit anymore. And because we only got a subsection of participants in this study, we did actually go and look at public-facing data from 2022, and this mirrored it completely. So there was nearly a complete removal at Deakin of on-campus face-to-face exams, and it was an 84% decrease in the amount of exams that were invigilated. That's like a huge change from pretty much everybody, well, 97% of all the exams being on campus and invigilated to nearly all of them not being proctored at all. The other noticeable change that we saw in our data was the change in exam weightings. So in 2019, from our survey, let me just hang up on this person. In 2019, in our study, we found the average weighting of an exam was around 42%. And then 2022, 2023, this reduced to 29%, so a 14% decrease. I guess what's interesting about this is some people obviously just removed it completely, but those that did retain it, decreasing the weighting of the exam really suggests this shift in the importance of having an exam, and also we'll talk about these in a minute, the threat of integrity was a real concern for these academics. So they started to think, okay, maybe I need to do all new assessment. And that's where we start seeing so many assessment changes where it's authentic and scaffolded. It gave them an opportunity to rethink what they were doing and rethink how important exams were in that. So some, as I said, some were really quite concerned about academic integrity at the time. We didn't even have ChatGPT. Don't even know what would have happened if we'd had both the pandemic and ChatGPT. But there was actually quite a few academics who said, do you know what, this is the student's responsibility. If they want to cheat, And like, you know, then they ultimately won't learn anything, which I think we still want students to learn things. So I'm not sure I totally agree. But I also use the word cheat in inverted commas because when it's an open book online test, is it cheating if you say you're allowed to like use any resources that you like to do that task? The other really interesting thing that we saw in this data was we went from having nearly 100% of exams at a set time. So think about, you need to be at the Deacon Gym at 12 o'clock on a Tuesday, and your exam is going to go for 2 hours till 2 p.m. What happened after the pandemic finished was the majority, 62%, had an open, what we were calling like an open format exam, which is that students could complete it any time in 24 hours. So they got to choose when they did it. So so this quote came from an academic who was like, students with limited time to go and do the exam, or those that had difficulty finding a time to do the exam, could actually pick any time that was suitable to them during that 24-hour period. And students really did they still do, because we still have this, pick like the most random times. Like you think no one's going to do an exam at 2 o'clock in the morning. Oh, they do. Some might get up and do it at 5 a.m. Some are doing it at 11 p.m. And, you know, I think that's really great because just by design, it is more accessible. If you have small children, you can wait for them to go to bed. You can do it around whatever your work commitments are. It's very inclusive. So this was largely driven by the university's change in policy to move away from on-campus supervised exams. And that obviously had a really big impact on the decision-making academics made. And this was, you know, they really did feel the pressure at the time when I was doing interviews. They felt the pressure of the university not wanting them to return to on-campus exams or just even have exams in general. Some academics were super happy about this, right? They were like so glad that some of the changes around MCQs, they were so happy that we had like reduced weighting for MCQs and we were moving away from having exams altogether. But there was like a subsection who were like, no, I just want the exam to come back, and I just want like it to be 60%, and I want my students in like a room so I can watch them doing that exam. So those are 3 changes that we looked at. And then we wanted to say, well, what are the things that helped to maintain academics to continue those changes on after the pandemic? Because remember, we could have just gone back to what we were doing in 2019. So we did look at Bronfenbrenner, just as a frame for looking at it, we used Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which really is like a theory that looks at the inherent interplay between individual characteristics and the immediate and kind of larger environment and how that contributes to transformation. So we just looked at the first 4, which is the individual level, so the academics themselves, the microsystems level, which is really around their discipline and their faculty. The mesosystem was like the university itself, and the exosystem was kind of other external factors like COVID. So I'm going to take you through some of the factors. We looked at 20 different factors and we got academics to talk about how did this influence your learning activities, how did this influence your decision to change your assessment, how did this influence your decision in the examinations. And we did kind of we did rankings for each of those 3 things, but we also did overall rankings. So as I go through, you'll see I've just kind of put the top ranked factors in the slides overall. So at the so what we're looking at here is the percentage of academics in the study that said this was very or extremely influential. We collapsed the 2 and we ignored everything else. The light grey is learning activities, the black is exams, and the dark grey is assessment. So at the exosystem level, it's no surprise that COVID-related issues was really highly ranked, number 3 across all 20 overall. And this really related to staff shortages, but also staff and student illness. So that really impacted their ability to get on campus or maybe their desire to come on campus even more. So, you know, students, it's a trend we continue to see, which is that students have not returned to campus in the same levels that we were seeing them in 2019, at least at Deakin. And we also asked them about professional accrediting bodies, which is ranked really lowly here, but only really because not all courses are accredited. But it should be acknowledged that those that were really said, this really like constricted what we could do, because there's just only so many things that the accrediting body will accept. And some even now, you know, force people to go back on campus to do exams, etc. Then we looked at the meso system. And I'm sure you're all surprised to see that the #1 ranked factor that affected academics was workload. If you ever spend any time in a room with academics, workload is always the #1 thing, and it was #1 here as well. And I guess the comments around workload kind of indicated really two contrasting situations. We kind of had one group of people saying, well, I feel really constrained in my teaching because I do not have enough time to do what I need to do. And another group saying, oh, it's amazing. When I have time, these are all the things that I can do. And some people were really kind of like, I need to work to my workload and I need more workload in order to do this work. And there was another group that kind of said, I don't really look at my workload. I'm not really trying to stick to the number of hours allocation for teaching. I just really want to do this thing that I've decided to do. And I guess this really reflects some of the hard choices that academics have to make, right? Like they have to, if they really want to invest in their teaching, then they just have to do it sometimes on top of all of the other things that they want to do. Otherwise, they're going to compromise what they're trying to achieve. Organizational instructions were the second highest ranking factor in how academics maintained their changes. And I think this really came from like Deakin having strong messaging, clear instructions, and kind of impactful leadership, particularly around exams, assessments, and learning activities. So this isn't just during COVID, we were all scrambling to work out what to do. Deakin, you know, made an effort, especially towards the end of COVID into 2022, 2023, where they did rewrite like all their exam procedure, their assessment procedure. They rethought what learning activities were, etc. And learning resources was ranked #7 out of 20, so still high, but not as important. And I guess like in terms of the instructional, organizational instructions, there was a lot of like academics talking about this was great that it really shook up what the organization was doing. This great quote that's like, well, the biggest change that happened as a consequence of the pandemic was the agility of the organization. I think finally they discovered you don't need to have a year and a half for approvals of changing stuff in your teaching. And this was like a really common sentiment that people were quite positive about the disruption and thought it was really useful from that aspect. However, I will say there were a few people that were like, no, organizational structures are really impinging on my right to make a decision about the things that I want to do. And as you can see here, you tell me, do I have liberty for these things? Can I choose? No, I can't choose. I'm a hostage to the system. But I'd say like overall, most people were pretty positive around having sort of structure and leadership to guide their practice moving forward. At the microsystem level, so this is discipline and faculty, we looked at a range of things from like teaching and learning support to the influence of colleagues to student drivers, like how satisfied students are. And really the one standout was local leadership. So this was like associate deans teaching and learning, associate heads of school teaching and learning, or directors of teaching and learning, sort of more broadly the school leadership group, like the head of school, and then to a bit of a lesser extent, course directors. And it really, the fact that this was like the highest one out of the group and ranked #4 overall really highlights how important discipline-specific and faculty level decisions are in helping to facilitate change with staff. like academics really felt so grateful. There was a lot of like, I think, you know, we all would have like fallen apart had we not had these discipline leaders. And there was also a lot of talk of how supported they felt. Like COVID gave them an opportunity to experiment, and then their local leaders said, hey, yeah, like let's just give it a go and see what happens. Like hopefully something good will work out. You know, we'll just try it. And they really appreciated just kind of having that support to try something new. At the individual level, we had desire to innovate, academic integrity, reflective practice, and scholarly activities. So innovation really drove learning activities and assessments. And this really ties back to this, like having the opportunity to experiment and shake things up. Integrity was the biggest influence on exams after organizational instruction. So it was very important in their decision-making with exams, as we discussed before. And then reflective practice was really important in designing learning activities. And I guess what we kind of heard from academics was that they were really reflecting and drawing upon what were the great things from 2019 when they were on campus, what really did they love during the pandemic, and how could they like bring those things together after the pandemic to kind of have this new changed curriculum. So overall, these were the most impactful drivers across the three areas. And I guess it's important to put them up just because if you're thinking about biggest bang for buck, what factors drive change, and you want it to drive change like across the whole university, it is the internal systemic pressures such as workload pressure and organizational instructions, the external factors like COVID-19 issues, which perhaps is now probably less important, discipline factors like local leadership, and individual factors like the desire to innovate. We did find there was some differences across like assessment, learning activities, and examinations. For example, like organizational structure instructions were like way more important for exams than assessment and learning activities. But like local leadership was equally important across all three things. So I'm nearly finished. I got 3 takeaway messages that I want to leave you with from the presentation. So first is that there was an absence of a like single dominant influencing factor that drove change. So this suggests that when universities confront significant shifts, whether it is the pandemic or whether it's Gen AI, really we need a multifaceted approach to change. Universities really need to craft like a very clear strategic vision that is complemented by resources, whether that is in workload or otherwise, and have really pragmatic implementation strategies. Concurrently, we need to have our local leaders, so think in the disciplines, they need to be able to have the latitude to kind of customize what the university is saying so that it fits within their discipline. And then frontline educators really just need to be trusted and have the autonomy to reflect and to be innovative and to then actualize these shifts that the university is wanting to see. The second take-home message is that we did not just revert to our pre-pandemic ways. There was this desire to innovate and experiment, and the pandemic was really seen as an opportunity to do things differently. You know, one academic said it actually gave us the freedom to experiment with things that we may never have gotten away with, right, before COVID because of the processes or not having enough time or, you know, things not being shaken up enough to kind of give you the motivation to take that big step to change something. And I think something that was really unique to Melbourne or to Victoria was how long we were in lockdown for and how long we spent online. So a lot of our units, it wasn't just emergency remote teaching where we did it one time, we chucked it on and it was for a short period of time. Everybody got to do their unit again in lockdown and again and again. Like some of our units would have run 6 times, right, in that time. So that's a lot of time to refine your processes and move away from just emergency remote teaching. And then lastly, there really was this intensified commitment to inclusivity and student-centered learning. it was just really apparent that, you know, what academics were trying to achieve and what they loved about things that happened in the pandemic was just how it kind of leveled the playing field a little bit and made things more accessible and catered to a more diverse range of student needs. And I'll leave you this one thought from Peter Goodyear, who said, this kind of signals the start of a change where flexibility is key and learning is designed to fit in with students' lives rather than students fitting in with university schedules. And lastly, I'll leave you with my dog, who was my best colleague during the pandemic and faithfully sat next to me every single day for like 2 years, and listened to like all my meetings on Zoom. And I finished with enough time. Thank you.
So we'll take some questions for Jack. I just will talk to the online folk for a moment. Please put your questions in the Q&A and Tom will translate them for us at some point. So not in the chat, in the Q&A, and you can upvote them. And we'll take questions from the floor as well too. We will have questions, formal questions for 15 minutes. Then I will formally shut the proceedings. And if there's more interest, we'll continue on. And when that's exhausted, people in the room can go out and have tea and cake, and people at home can go out and have tea and cake, but just not together. So any questions in the room? We'll start within the room. Anything in the room for Jack to start with?
Thank you, Jackie. One thing that I know it's not the main point of the presentation, but it struck me, the interviewee or the group of people that said, oh, we are hostages of the system.
Yes.
I know they were a minority, but from your data, there's anything that says what are the kind of things they want freedom to do? Was it more innovative stuff, more flexible, or was it going back to the old ways of?
I think it was a semi like going back to their old ways, as in they had a lot more latitude, I guess, to just decide what they were doing. So for exams was like probably the one that was the most pointiest or the most dividing, where people were like, look, I used to just do whatever I wanted in my exam. My exam was however I wanted it to be. Like I put students in a room and gave them a piece of paper and told them to fill it out for 2 hours. And then we moved to this, like, it's mostly open book, right? You weren't allowed to have so many multiple choice questions. So they just felt like there was a lot of information coming down that was like affecting their ability to make a choice. And this is also on the back of COVID, where there just was a lot of organizational instructions of what you could and couldn't do at any time, right? So yeah, I think it was sort of maybe going back to way before 2019, kind of where you got to do whatever you liked. Yeah.
Have you got anything online, Tom?
Yeah, we sure do. Do you want to read them into the microphone?
Let's get off.
Thanks, Joe. First question from Yuso, and I think this was asked when you had that fabulous bar graph up showing increasing and decreasing elements. Yuso asks, did you find instances of changing learning objectives or standards? So not just how something is taught and assessed, but what was taught and assessed?
We didn't really look at that specifically, but in the interviews, I mean, it is a whole package suite, right? Like if you're changing your assessment, a lot of the time there was changes to thinking about what they wanted the students to learn, i.e. the learning outcomes, but it wasn't really a total focus of ours.
Another question from the room. I'm going to actually ask a question. And it just was striking me when you're talking about, I mean, it's fascinating to me that the themes are ones that you see echoed elsewhere, you know, time and workload, local leadership, institutional policy, and it's like a good reflection. So something that I was thinking about with your photos and talking about pandemic, you know, taking us back to that time, was what an emotional time it was. It was a deeply emotional time. Did those emotions persist in these changes? Were people still, like, was there kind of like a visceral?
That's how I felt about this presentation, honestly. I was like, don't make me go back. Look, there was, but I actually would say, because we did a whole lot of stuff that I haven't presented here around what students were doing. And students carried that through more, right? So they also had an emotional experience, so did the academics. But then afterwards, we saw students were still getting way more extensions and requests. They were still having difficulty emotionally regulating. They were over-disclosing. They needed way more support than they ever did in 2019. And those things do continue to emotionally impact academics. They felt quite exhausted by the fact that that was continuing. And that did drive some of the changes that they were doing, because, say, for example, with the scaffolded and sequential assessment, that was also sort of there to, like, yes, it's better for the student, but it sort of protects them, right? Like, if you're like, how do I move a student through and how do I get everyone through and trying to stop all the questions, that's how you do it.
Yeah, interesting.
Thanks so much, Jack. My question is unsurprisingly about the exams, the integrity, all
It's
that
so
stuff.
surprising.
I know. I mean, there's exams and then there's exams. You know,
Yeah.
like we have a formal exam that's listed in the thing and we go to a room and whatever, and then we just have a thing that we do in class.
An end of unit assessment, I should call it, you know.
Yeah. I'm interested sort of to what extent were people trying to stealthily get around any of these rules or requirements, or
How much were they stealthily? I mean, they are
I think
academics,
pragmatically.
like, so there was a bit of like trying to get around the things, but mostly, like, I think it became really apparent because there was like 2 years of being online. Had this been a shorter lockdown, I would say, like a shorter period of time, they would have found some way around it. But because it was 2 years, people just sort of really gave up and thought, I don't want my exam anymore if it has to be like this, or I need to like change the weighting. So I don't think they were, for the most part, trying to get around it. Like, they had long enough locked down to see a different way of approaching it that might be better for students.
Thank you. And I have one second sort of exams one. I find the shift to unsupervised exams really, really interesting. It's like it's a task that we say it's the genre of an exam,
Yeah.
but without any of the trappings like supervision or whatever. I mean, this is a broad assessment question. Why not just give them an assignment to do? Like, what was the sort of thinking behind it's an exam, but you can kind of do it whenever you want, and we're not going to supervise it?
As someone who comes from a school who's quite in love with exams,
Is it that we don't have to pay as much money to get it marked?
there is a pragmatic aspect to it, but that's not totally it. People in my context, they like to know students could get the information, right? And so, we used to do it when I was in a room and we could supervise them and it was coming from their own knowledge. But in reality, most of the academics, like in my school, feel kind of okay that it's open book, because when do you ever, like, I look stuff up all the time, on my device when I'm trying to do something. So they were kind of okay with it. But what they wanted was, like, under pressure in a short period of time, you still have to have the foundational knowledge to be able to make sense of the question and answer it correctly for the most part. Now we know at that time. Now we have ChatGPT, and that's muddying the waters a little bit for everyone. But at that time, when chat wasn't around, it still required a foundational skill to demonstrate you had some evaluative judgment. You could Google the question and the answer, but you still had to work out if it was the right one for that question.
Thanks.
Back to online.
No, I can see it on. Thanks, Phil. Next question, I'm just going by highest upvotes here, from Leanne is, based on your findings and driving factors for change, particularly the workload matter, which appear to be universal and internal pressures, could you comment on the need for Deakin and other universities to consider building in time for pause and time for capability development in study periods and workload models?
Great question. So I can't speak for other universities, but I can say, like at Deakin, we're doing a huge workload allocation review at the moment. I'm part of the one in my faculty of Health. And so It is one of the things that are on the table is talking about how we innovate and how, like, what we call curriculum development in the workload, and whether that is sufficient time in this more modern way of teaching. Like, that was designed before we kind of did a lot of online and hybrid teaching, and it is very different. Designing for online takes so much longer to do. You know, if I'm doing a stand-up lecture, I can like come do my lecture and you're done. If you're online, you've got to think of all the scaffolds that sit around that, you know, the videos, the content, maybe some activities to get them engaged. And it can take a long period of time. So yes, I think that it is really important that we do pauses and we think about how we might build into workloads well, I would like, ideally, there to be kind of discretion time, and that discretion time maybe for your teaching some years, maybe you sometimes use it for research, maybe you use it to do external service, but that there is this flex time that if you want to do something innovative in your teaching, there is that space there.
Take another one.
Paula asks, I'm curious about the cases that kept exams or moved to online quizzes instead of projects, etc. Were they from particular domains and cohorts, for example, first year?
So on-campus exams, we literally have none except for, I think, the law school has an exam that their accrediting body requires, and medicine, you know, maybe medicine.
Medicine has exams.
Has,
I don't
like,
know the yet.
Yeah. Everybody else, Paula, is completely online. I will say in my own context, we have had some exemptions in like the weighting of our exams, just because in first year, for example, we have really huge student numbers. So it's really challenging to mark like 100, 1,500 short answer questions in like 5-day turnaround.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had, but otherwise everybody's online. Most people are not invigilated, and the ones that are invigilated are primarily accredited courses.
And sorry, the health ones, the medicine, it's because they're practical.
Yeah.
So they're you know, you're doing physical things.
Yeah. The law one is really the only kind of, when you think of a traditional exam back on campus. Yeah, that's it.
I feel like, but anyway, I have shares prerogative. So something else that struck me in this conversation is also the changes that were kept that had sort of material presences. So, you know, if you do a video and you chunk something into a video, you have that video sitting there, you're not going to throw it away. If you go to the effort of designing something, you're not going to throw it away. Do you have a sense that when the cycle comes again, that people will invest the time to make the objects, or will they return back, do you think?
So I think that key driver about student equity and wellbeing was, it came through so often in the interviews. It was really, really strong that they could see how it was just so beneficial for students who couldn't make it physically to, say, a lecture theatre in this example. So I hope that will carry through. Certainly, just through my own conversations in our school, the last time we did an on-campus lecture in my school was 2019. Right? We had not reverted back, and we have a combination of pre-recorded content with modules and H5P objects and or live online lectures, which actually I still think this is a much better product than we were doing in 2019, where we had a non-expert often doing the like Geelong lecture and somebody else doing the Burwood lecture. Now we have like the expert, and usually we have 2 or 3 people doing the live online thing, because there might be 700 students in Zoom. And they're actually getting the source of truth and the expert and getting to spend real time with like the unit chair sometimes. I think it's better, for sure.
Yeah. Great. So I'll bring the end to the formal proceedings now, but questions can continue. So stay online or stay in the room or go get cake. Could you please join me in thanking Jack for what was I think it's a really interesting study. So really raises a lot of questions.
A bit triggering, but interesting.
Traumatic, but true.
Yeah.
And I'll just take this moment to sell our next seminar, which has me in it. So come along. I'm working with Joe. Someone else is going to have to do the panel in the back of the room, because Joe can't be both talent and tech support. We're talking about evaluative judgment, AI, and authentic assessment. And this is really, we put it as one, but it's really a two-handed seminar. I'm going to talk about the role of evaluative judgment and generative AI and why we need to think about quality. And Joe's going to talk about how in the digital world that we live in, authentic assessment becomes a matter of a broader and what would you say, Joe? I'm throwing you.
Broader, more multifaceted consideration that needs to take into account multiple perspectives.
Thank you. Excellent. And so join us for that. So thanks again to Jack, and we will see you next time, or more questions. Any more questions?
There's a few online.
Okay, let's go with the online.
Tom's asked 2 questions that both have the same upvote, so I'm going to choose the one that I think's more interesting to me. Tom asks if you could comment on, are universities ready to switch back to online learning if there's another pandemic or war breaks out?
Oh, bloody hell. No war, hopefully no pandemic, or we might be zombies like on that picture that ChatGPT had. I mean, Deakin is 100% ready. I reckon we could go back pretty quickly, given that we've retained a lot of the online-ness and we know what it's like. The first time, right, like we spent a lot of time training people how to use Zoom or even like how to use a chat function. This time we won't need to do that. So we're in a much better place than we were.
And we already have the UGG boots. It's all
And I'm up to my second pair of UGG boots now. They're black. And I'm ready to be at home with my UGG boots on.
We'll take another one.
We can take another one. Tom's other question, which has the second most upvotes, is if you could comment on problems that turned up with not having online exams not being proctored, particularly in regards to changing rules. He's also interested in accreditation bodies, but I think you covered that.
Yeah. Phil, do you want to answer that question? If you can, in a short.
Yeah. I think unproctored online exams are very challenging as a high stakes summative assessment task. I think they're inappropriate for that, but not everything we do in higher ed, even that we call summative assessment, is really high stakes in terms of determining if we give someone a degree. So I think it's just about the placement inside the degree, where things go. And also we acknowledged during that sort of emergency remote teaching period that, hey, it's kind of, we're not always going to have the Fort Knox of assessment security every time. We were okay with that as a sector.
Yeah. And I think our response at Deakin was really that if you are having uninvigilated exams, they just need to be weighted way less, right? They just, the importance of the information they're giving you about the student's capability, you know, isn't the same as what it was in like a locked, they weren't locked in a hall, but sitting down the supervisor. They were locked in the hall. Yeah.
I might add one small thing to that as well. Like the literature on face-to-face exams and cheating and integrity in those suggests they're not as rosy as sort of academic folklore might make us believe. And, you know, I love this paper by Rowena Harper and Tracy Brettag and colleagues that found more third-party cheating in face-to-face exams than in take-home assignments, and also that we detected less of it. So that was based on staff self-report of what they detect and students self-report of what they do. So we have a lot of assumptions about the integrity of face-to-face exams.
Shall we take one more online? Is there any more? Wave your hand if there's someone in the room who wants to ask anything as well. While we're going.
Christian asked quite a long question. Teaching academics could tend to claim that they don't have enough time or are too busy to innovate in teaching. I think innovation in teaching is the focus here. Additionally, many academics come from research backgrounds and aren't qualified to teach as part of their role. This challenge can highlight that they haven't fully developed the knowledge, skills, or vision necessary to be effective teachers, thus effective teaching aligns with abilities they haven't mastered. The question is, how much of this issue in regards to innovative teaching is due to this lack of time, insufficient teaching skills, or inadequate prioritisation? If I was going to sum up the question, I would, if you could comment on the issue of teaching innovation relative to some of the issues that came up in the talk.
I think good teaching takes a lot of time, and it is not adequately workloaded most of the time to do what you need to do to be innovative, and to have thoughtful design, really. So the answer to the question is, I think it's not about necessarily not wanting to take the extra step to do the extra work. It's just that everything is about choices and compromise. And I think universities could do a better job of value signalling to staff around where they want to put their attention. So if you only get promoted because you have 100 publications, then the 100 publications is what you're going to focus on, and not your innovative teaching.
Well,
On that happy note.
On that happy note, I think that we should go have some cake. Are there many more questions online there, Tom?
Anna's asked if you could share your references, but apart from that, no.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Then definitely cake time. Thanks, Jack.
No worries.
Anna, she'll share her references and we'll give it.